All right, everyone, welcome in. We are diving into some seriously big questions today. Consciousness, simulated universes. We're even going to touch on the meaning of life.
Sounds ambitious.
It is. And we've got a really interesting mix of material to work with this time. We've got a discussion with God, which is a fictional story.
Okay.
And then to pair with that, we've got a nonfiction piece, A Guide to the Celestial Faith.
I like it. I always find it fascinating how fiction can sometimes illuminate these really complex ideas in ways that a straightforward explanation just, I don't know, just can't quite capture.
It's true. It's like a story can kind of like sneak up on you.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about things in a whole new way.
Exactly.
So speaking of stories, let's jump right into a discussion with God. So we're introduced to our main character, Dr. Quentin Everett. He's a physicist, and he's come up with this like totally radical theory about consciousness.
Okay.
And he calls it, are you ready for this? The intelligence particle.
The intelligence particle. So like a fundamental building block of consciousness.
You got it. And Quentin is absolutely convinced he's found it.
Of course, that's how it always starts.
Right. But here's the catch. When he presents his big idea to the scientific community, well, let's just say they don't exactly throw him a party.
Yeah, I can imagine. Rejection's never easy. But in science, where you're often challenging the status quo, it's got to hit even harder.
Absolutely. And the book really digs into how devastated Quentin is by this. It's like his whole world comes crashing down.
It's more than just data points and theories for scientists like Quentin, right? It's their life's work. It's about pushing the boundaries of what we know about ourselves and the universe.
Exactly. And so, feeling totally lost and disillusioned, he stumbles upon this really unique bookstore. It's called the Mystic Tome.
Even the name sounds like something straight out of an Indiana Jones movie or something.
Right. And it's in this bookstore that he has this chance encounter with a man named Marcus.
Okay.
And this is where we get our first taste of the celestial faith.
Intriguing. So this bookstore becomes a kind of portal to a whole other way of seeing things.
It really does. And within those very walls, within that bookstore, Quentin gets invited to visit something called the Celestial Temple.
A temple?
Yeah. And the way it's described, it's this really fascinating blend of like modern architecture and ancient elements. Think sleek steel and glass, but then like intertwined with all these intricate carvings in the stone.
That's fascinating. It's like even in the architecture, they're saying, hey, maybe science and spirituality aren't so different after all.
Right. Like they've found a way to blend the two together.
Yeah. I'm curious to see where they take that.
Oh, you and me both. So we're going to get more into the celestial faith and what they believe a little bit later. But first, we meet someone really important inside this temple. Her name's Tasha.
Okay.
And she's described as like this gifted intuitive. But what's really interesting is the book mentions that she's been through some incredibly rough times. Like we're talking a life-altering accident, the loss of her musical career. I mean, really, really difficult things.
Wow. That's a lot to deal with.
It is. And the way she found her way back, her path to healing, it was through exploring things like solfeggio frequencies, sound healing, you know, things that we often think of as like alternative therapies.
It's interesting, though, right, how there's this growing interest in those kinds of therapies.
Totally.
And it's not just about, you know, the woo-woo stuff anymore. People are starting to really investigate the impact of sound and vibration on our well-being.
Exactly. And in the novel, those solfeggio frequencies, they actually become super important later on in Quentin's journey.
Oh, interesting. I'm curious to see how that plays out.
Me too. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Right.
So for now, we have Quentin, who's still reeling from this whole science world rejection. He's finding himself drawn into this world of intuition, of meditation, and then there's this whole mysterious aspect of the celestial faith and their teachings.
Okay.
And to kind of immerse him even further, the novel dives into this thing called the talisman meditation.
The talisman meditation, what is that?
So from what I gather, it's designed to be this really intense sensory experience. Think like vivid colors, humming sounds, that sort of thing.
Huh. Sounds intense. It's almost as if the novel is using these really vivid descriptions, these sensory details, to kind of make the celestial faith more tangible, more real.
Yeah. Because even someone like Quentin, or maybe even our listeners, right?
Yeah.
We might come to these ideas with a healthy dose of skepticism at first.
Absolutely.
So it's like the story is saying, okay, we know this might sound out there, but just come along for the ride, see where it goes.
I'm game.
And trust me, things are about to get really, really interesting as Quentin goes deeper into the heart of the celestial faith. But before we go there, let's take a quick detour over to A Guide to the Celestial Faith. so we can understand a little more about what this whole belief system is all about.
Sounds like a plan. It'd be helpful to have some context as we follow Quentin further down this rabbit hole. So it's interesting, right? We leave off with Quentin about to explore this celestial faith, and then we jump over to, like, this guidebook. And the guidebook, it dives right into this concept of, get this, the simulation hypothesis.
I know. Like, out of all the things to start with. It's funny, though, because even before we got these sources, even outside of a discussion with God, the idea that maybe, just maybe, our reality's like a computer program, it's really taken off.
Yeah, it's not just the realm of science fiction anymore. We're talking like serious philosophers, physicists, they're all starting to consider this.
Like who?
Oh, tons of people, but one that comes to mind, like Nick Bostrom, he's a philosopher at Oxford, and he's got this whole thing. He basically argues that if, and this is a big if, but if a civilization gets advanced enough that it can create like these super realistic simulations, he's saying it actually becomes statistically more likely that we are living in a simulation rather than being like the original civilization that kicked it all off.
Whoa.
Right? Like, think about it.
That is a total mind bender.
Total mind bender. And a guide to the celestial faith. It's like they took that mind-bending idea and ran with it. It basically lays it out there, the universe. It's a simulation. But then they take it a step further, right?
Oh, yeah. They go there.
Oh, yeah. And they introduce this whole concept of, are you ready for this? Grand organized designers.
Catchy.
Right. But they shorten it to God.
Okay, I kind of like that. Like a different take on a familiar concept.
Right. Instead of the singular all-powerful being, you've got God-a-D as this, like, collective intelligence.
Okay, so it's less about a he or a she and more like a they.
Exactly, a they. This whole network of beings who created the simulation, and who knows, maybe they're still managing it, tweaking things behind the scenes.
So like the ultimate programmers.
Exactly. And this is where that intelligence particle idea comes back in, but in a slightly different way than Quentin's whole theory.
Okay, so how does a guide to the celestial faith use that term? Because in the story, Quentin thought he'd found like this scientific basis for consciousness, right?
Right. But the guidebook, it takes it in a more, I don't know, a more spiritual direction. It describes the intelligence particle as this like fundamental unit of consciousness, this spark of awareness that's woven into the very fabric of the simulation.
So it's not so much about the physical brain itself, but about something bigger.
Way bigger, because they're saying these particles are basically pieces of God.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Pieces of God guide, like literally.
That's how I'm reading it.
Yeah.
And then they take this even further and tie it into the idea of reincarnation.
Reincarnation, okay, yeah. That's a pretty central concept to a lot of spiritual traditions.
It really is. And in the celestial faith, it's not just about being reborn into another body, another life. It's way more expansive than that.
How so?
Okay, imagine this. These intelligence particles, these little sparks of God, of consciousness, they get born into the simulation, they live out their lives, and then when they die, they go back to the source, right? Back to the network, the collective. But they're not just absorbed back in, they're carrying all these experiences with them, all the lessons, the growth they went through.
Interesting. So it's like they graduate from one level of the simulation and then level up.
You could say that. And then they come back for another round, another life, another chance to evolve and learn.
So it's almost like the universe is a giant school.
That's a great way to think about it. And within the school, we've got everything. We've got challenges, triumphs, moments of pure joy. And yeah, of course, we've got suffering too.
And that's always the tricky part, right? Because if the universe is a creation, if there's this Joe D, even a collective one, how do you reconcile that with all the pain, all the darkness that exists?
Right. Where does all that fit in? Well, a guide to the celestial faith, they have an answer for that too. It's all part of their concept of what they call the celestial plan. They actually emphasize that both the light and the darkness are necessary, joy and suffering. They're not seen as good or bad, not rewards or punishments. They're all just essential parts of the learning process.
Interesting. Like necessary contrasts.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't really appreciate the highs without experiencing some lows, right? You can't grow without a little bit of, friction or challenge.
Okay, that makes sense. But where does free will fit into all of this? If we're just players in some grand cosmic video game, do we really have any control over the choices we make?
The age-old question. And it's a good one. And the guidebook, it actually emphasizes that free will is crucial. Even within this simulated reality, the choices we make, they matter a lot.
Okay, I'm listening. So even though, like, Zoom out to the big picture.
Mm,
We might be these little consciousnesses, these intelligence particles running around in this giant computer program.
right.
It's not like we just get to say, well, nothing I do matters. It's all a simulation anyway.
Exactly. It reminds me of that quote. Oh, who said it? I think it was Gandhi. Something like, live as though what you do makes a difference. Because it does.
I like that.
The celestial faith, it seems like they're on that same wavelength. They're saying our actions, they have an impact. Even within this simulated reality, what we do, it ripples outward. It affects us, it affects others, it affects the whole experience.
Okay, so up to this point, it's been a lot of like really interesting philosophy and big picture cosmic stuff.
Yeah.
But this is where it feels like the celestial faith, it starts to get kind of practical.
It does, doesn't it? And it's interesting because this is where we see A Discussion with God, the novel, and the Guide to the Celestial Faith. They kind of converge a bit.
How so?
Well, remember at the beginning how Quentin had this crisis of faith in science?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Right. Well, you might think, okay, so the Guide to the Celestial Faith, it's all about simulation theory, right? So they must be anti-science.
Yeah, you'd kind of assume that.
But they're not. They actually encourage scientific exploration. Like they see it as another way of uncovering the truth about reality.
Seriously. Even though they're saying the universe is like a computer program.
Yeah. In fact, they even suggest that if we, or maybe some other super advanced civilization out there, if they got their hands on the right technology, they might actually be able to find the edges of the simulation.
Whoa, okay, that's next level. So it's not about choosing sides, science or spirituality. It's more like they both have a part to play.
That's how I see it. They both contribute to the bigger picture, and maybe, just maybe, they both lead to the same conclusion, which is our reality is way more mind-blowingly complex and interconnected than we can even begin to imagine.
Mind-blowingly complex and interconnected. I can get behind that.
Right. And speaking of interconnectedness, there's another point where the celestial faith, it aligns with a lot of other like spiritual traditions.
Okay.
They put a huge emphasis on ethics, on living a certain way.
Okay.
And the Guide to the Celestial Faith, it talks a lot about aligning yourself with what they call the power of the Force.
Okay, I got to ask. The power of the Force. That sounds like something straight out of like a Star Wars movie.
I know, right? It definitely has a certain ring to it. But they're basically talking about tapping into this positive energy, this interconnected consciousness that they believe flows through everything.
So what? Like, we've all got these intelligence particles, and the goal is to use them for good.
Exactly. It's about making choices that contribute to the, I don't know, the positive evolution of everything. To choose love over fear, compassion over judgment, that kind of thing.
And they have some practical advice on how to do that.
Yeah. They talk about meditation, prayer, acts of service, stuff that a lot of people find helpful, even if they don't buy into the whole simulation thing.
Totally. Just good life advice in general.
Right. And I think that's an important point to make. You don't necessarily have to believe that we're living in some kind of like hyper-realistic video game
Yeah.
to find something valuable in these teachings. Because at its core, what's the celestial faith really about? It's about purpose. It's about connection. It's about recognizing that our actions have an impact.
And that's a pretty good message, no matter how you slice it.
I think so too. It is a lot to wrap your head around. Consciousness, simulated realities, it's a lot.
It is a lot. But that's the beauty of these deep dives. We get to explore these big questions, these big ideas, and hopefully, walk away with some new perspectives.
And maybe even more questions.
And more questions.
Yeah.
Always more questions. But that's the fun of it, right? So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those big questions, and who knows, maybe we'll bump into you again in the next layer of the simulation.
I'll see you there.